This is a water ark which shows the country's highest respect to those who devoted their lives for the safe and peace of the homeland. That is a Chinese PLA plane carrying the remains of 117 Chinese soldiers killed in the Korean War in the 1950s. Also, this is the 7th such repatriation from South Korea. This is live footage from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport in northeast China. For more on that, let's cross live to our reporter Sun Tianyuan in Shenyang. He's been following this very closely. Hello Tianyuan, tell us what's happening on the ground.
Hello Pandon, I'm at Shenyang International Airport where a special plane has just landed at the airport. It's carrying 117 remains of the Chinese war heroes who were killed in the Korean War 70 years ago. And there will be a short ceremony in just a few minutes to pay tribute to the fallen heroes and Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan and war veterans. And also students and soldiers are expected to join the ceremony. And after the ceremony, an honor guard will carry the caskets of the 117 war heroes to across the city to Shenyang's cemetery of Korean war martyrs. And there they will join their comrades and they will be buried in an underground tomb tomorrow. And so far, as you can see behind me, the plane, which is Y-20, China's domestically developed transport aircraft, has just placed in the location, and we are ready to take the later procedure to carry out the task. All right, it looks like we're still a few minutes ahead before the ceremony. That's all I have right now. Back to you, Pandong.
Thank you very much, our reporter Sun Tianyuan at Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. And a plane carrying the remains of Chinese soldiers died in the Korean War has just arrived in Shenyang City in northeast China. For more insight, we're joined in the studio by Professor Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. So, Professor, what do you make of the significance of this repatriation process this year?
Indeed, I think this year, this repatriation event, even though it has been carried out annually since 2014, is very special in the context. It's been, of course, in terms of timeline, it's been delayed because of the COVID-19. And secondly, it has been the largest numbers of these remains, the heroes, and over 117 being now repatriated to China and back to home. And thirdly, of course, I think if you look at the significance of this event, it also resonates large in the context that as China and as a kind of a peace-loving troops, nations, and will also, I think, pay highest regards and honor to those that has been sacrificed.
Well, talking about that, let's talk about what we just watched live from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. Water Ark, of course, is part of the highest regard to show the country's respect to those heroes you just mentioned. But there is something unique this year, because looking at that plane carrying the Chinese soldiers' remains, that is China-owned developed Y-20. It's the most advanced carrier plane in the Chinese Air Force. What do you make of this gesture?
Indeed, I think this is the airplane, the special plane. I think the Chinese sort of we manufactured. This is, I think, the latest, the most advanced one, and the number of this special plane is number one. Again, it's giving the highest, a symbol of highest honor to these soldiers, these martyrs. I think the significance, as far as I'm concerned, is that we are now facing an increasingly sort of unstable and uncertain world. The 70 years ago, the new China was just founded.
The People's Republic.
The People's Republic
Yes.
was just founded. So we were facing a very sort of difficult world. And 70 years later, the world has changed so much. China has changed. But the spirit of these martyrs that has been for the sake of the peace in the region and the world, and for the peace and the stability of the homeland. They sacrificed, they gave up their lives without any hesitation.
So let's
this
trace
kind of
back
spirit
history.
We have to be, have to
Of course. Let's trace back history a little bit more, because 70 years ago, back then, so talking about Air Force, back then PLA Air Force was relatively weak compared to the so-called strongest military force in the world back then, the United States. So China was actually forced into this war. Tell us more about that.
Indeed, I think if you look at the so-called comprehensive national power, in particular, I think the military sort of equipment or these airplanes, others. I think 70 years ago, I don't think we can talk about any kind of Chinese-made, designed and made aircraft. We didn't have actually a kind of airplane per se. We have some airplanes. I think
some are even donated from overseas Chinese.
Exactly. So in terms of hardware, in terms of development, China has, made a big progress, made so much progress. But the task for China as a rising power, as a peace-loving country, remains same. We have to, we hope that there will be no conflict, there will be no war like that. But as a nation, peace-loving nation, we have to prepare. We have to make sure that the spirits of the martyrs, the blood that have been shed of the martyrs will not be wasted. So this is something I think a very special occasion, and to commemorate the martyrs and to carry forward the spirit, but more important to ensure that peace is the most important thing we are looking for.
Still looking at that particular period in history, what do you make of the importance of the fight of the Chinese volunteer force on the Korean peninsula? Because back then, as you just mentioned, the People's Republic was just founded, and it was faced by this strong alliance of Western armies.
Yeah, we have to make very clear the war or this that China being engaged in was imposed by the aggression, West-led aggression, U.S.-led aggression.
Actually, so the mission statement back then, if my memory is correct, was called "Safeguard Home and Defend the Nation," right?
Exactly. That's the real sort of the purpose of China joined that war. So we were certainly meant to defend our homeland, our motherland. It also meant to, I think, resist aggression and defend peace. And for that, 70 years ago, even China was weak, was not as developed as today. China had, the courage, and China had the spirit to do that. I think today, 70 years ago, I would say that China is much stronger, and China is much more developed. But still, I think when aggression is imposed on China, when China feels that it's necessary to defend peace of the region and the world, China would have to. And for that, the spirit of these martyrs, we will have to honor. That's why we are giving the highest possible honor and regard to these martyrs.
Professor, we'll be getting back to you on this. The remains of more Chinese volunteer soldiers who perished in the Korean War are returning to the home soil. It's the 7th such ceremony to be held after Beijing and Seoul reached an agreement in 2013. Gao Yiming has more.
March 28, 2014. At Shenyang Taoxian Airport in China's northeast. Inside the boxes include skeletal remains as well as personal possessions such as shoes and stamps of Chinese volunteer soldiers who perished during the 3-year Korean War. Decorated in China's national flag, fighter jets escorted them home across the Yellow Sea. Soldiers hold welcome banners, and comrades stand in salute. For this moment, they had waited for decades.
We must never forget the sacrifices of those who died, and to treat them as spiritual role models.
Over 190,000 Chinese soldiers died in the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, but very few were buried on their homeland. A total of 599 have been returned over the past 6 years after Beijing and Seoul came to an agreement in 2013. All of them have been buried in Shenyang Martyrs Cemetery, which was first established in 1951.
Since 1993, I have come to the cemetery on my own every year, just before Tomb Sweeping Festival. At first, it was spontaneous. Nowadays, though, there are fewer and fewer living veterans, so we come to pay respects in groups.
This year, 117 fallen heroes from the war are returning to China. They had to wait a few months longer than anticipated because of the coronavirus pandemic. But they're finally now ready to rest beside their comrades back on home soil. Gao Yiming, CGTN.
So, Professor, let's talk more about this since we're looking at the live footage from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. Tell us more about this agreement between China and South Korea on the repatriation of the Chinese soldiers' remains.
Yeah, the agreement, I think, signed between China and ROK was significant. It's significant in the sense that it, I think, carried forward the spirit of humanitarianism. The war was very unfortunate, as we have discussed, that China was imposed. China was compelled to engage, to take part for the sake of defending its homeland and for the peace in the region. And at that time, China and the volunteers are fighting kind of forces with participated U.S.-led forces and including ROK. But 70 years later, 63 years ago, the ROK, I think, pledged that they would like to repatriate these remains that are being unearthed, uncovered on their part of the country. And this is, of course, a very good gesture of friendship, and to which China very much appreciates. And ever since then, it has been carried out annually, and to coincide actually the tomb sweeping ceremony and traditional festival, I think both commemorated by China and ROK. So I thought that this year, even though it had been delayed because of COVID-19, but the fact that it had been carried forward, is significant. It helps a lot. In particular, I think the people-to-people exchanges, sentiments towards of the two countries.
So just as you described, it's a strong symbol of humanitarianism. But what about this telling about the diplomatic ties between China and South Korea? As you just mentioned, the two countries were enemies 70 years ago. But what about now? What does this agreement, what does this process tell about the current diplomatic ties?
Diplomatic ties between China and ROK has been good. I think the two countries have a kind of we call it strategic cooperative partnership, and which goes beyond, I think, political. It covers many areas, as many as possible, and including, as I said, the very important areas of people-to-people interactions. And it also has, I think, have reached some agreement on how to manage difficult and sensitive issues like the one we're talking about. And China and ROK are important sort of countries and partners for cooperation in the region, and they have been that kind of a relationship, strategic cooperative partnership, has served a kind of stabilizing forces and factor for the region. And we know that at either at the level of high level exchanges, there have been China and ROK has been very close. There's also at the people-to-people level, and there, of course, we have economic and trade relationship, regional cooperation, China, ROK, Japan, trilateral cooperation, you name it. And of course, on the sensitive issues related to security issues, China and ROK has also been a very effective and comprehensive coordination and consultation, which again helps the two countries to further develop the relationship.
So as we are watching live footage from Shenyang Airport, this looks like quite a solemn ceremony, occasion, and it's broadcast live to the whole nation and even to the whole world. So what does this occasion mean for the people of the nation?
Yeah, it's a very, I think, sort of solemn occasion indeed. And it raises, of course, a big question, as we discussed, that from the Chinese side, we have to do more. We have to remember forever the sacrifice of these martyrs, for the sake, as I said, for the peace and stability of the nation, and also for the peace of the region. And for South Korea, it is too, I think no country, no people would like to fight a war. And what kind of lessons we can learn. But more importantly, I think if you look at the region, there are also issues that could cause conflicts or even war. And the Korean War was ended, but peace has not returned. So China and South Korea are okay. I think in commemorating this event and to add a gesture of sort of friendship and to which China appreciate, and China and ROK should also work together, join our hands together to prevent the recurrence or replications of a war like that, and more importantly, to ensure peace will prevail.
And Professor, now let's get more from Shenyang. Our reporter Sun Tianyuan visited a place where the martyrs will be put to rest.
Today we're going to visit the cemetery of Korean War martyrs in Shenyang, home to hundreds of fallen Chinese heroes in one of the world's fiercest conflicts, what China calls the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. This year, the cemetery is scheduled to receive 117 Chinese martyrs who were killed in the war 70 years ago, just a few days before China's Martyrs' Day. It's the 7th batch China has received from South Korea since 2014, when the country first started transferring them.
This reflects the two countries' friendly and peaceful settlement on this matter, a token of goodwill by South Korea that China appreciates.
On Monday, the heroes' coffins are expected to join the comrades in an underground tomb in the cemetery. This year's burial is the second largest after nearly 440 Chinese soldiers were laid to rest in 2014.
We'll send a staff member to the airport to coordinate the work. Later, there will be a proper burial for the remains of the Chinese martyrs who were killed in the war.
China's Ministry of Civil Affairs says nearly 200,000 Chinese soldiers died on the Korean peninsula during the 3-year conflict. Most of them were buried on foreign soil, far from home.
After the Korean War, the two sides have boosted trade and both have realized that peace is crucial to well-being. So the two have valued and cherished it since then.
Between 2014 and 2019, the remains of nearly 600 Chinese soldiers was sent back from South Korea. Seoul has agreed to continue cooperating with Beijing to recover the remains of Chinese soldiers and finally return them to their resting place back home.
And tracing back history, it was 1950, a year after the founding of the People's Republic of China, when US-led forces pushed the Korean War right into China's border. Hundreds of thousands of young people in China joined the war to defend their homeland. Tianyuan again.
In 1950, 17-year-old Sun De-shan, like many young people his age, volunteered to join the Korean War.
The U.S. was like a flame. It burned the DPRK first, and next would be China. As a neighbor, China must put out the fire. If not, China would be next. We fought to defend our nation and homeland. A man without a country is like a child without a home.
Many new recruits, including Jin Donghui, were sent to the foreign battlefield after just a month of training. Facing the rookies, some of history's fiercest battles, and an experience they'd remember for the rest of their lives.
While we charged forward, bombs, shells, and fragments exploded next to us. Many of us fell, but we marched on no matter what. At first we were afraid, but we knew it's either them or us, so we braved up and fought hard.
I never thought I would make it through the war. I took a hit here and here, in my hand, my head. I thought I would die there. I was lucky to be back.
China's Ministry of Civil Affairs says nearly 200,000 martyrs died on the Korean peninsula. A Chinese force known as the Iron 7th Company was down to just 7 men after several tough fights. At the bottom of the valley, Jin watched his comrades fall one by one as enemy troops swarmed up the position.
They ran out of bullets and grenades. The 7 soldiers fixed their bayonets and readied for hand-to-hand combat.
Saved by the sound of the bugle, enemy troops thought there was a counterattack and retreated. Chinese soldiers often had to fight taller and stronger enemies in the most primitive way on account of the huge gap in weapons. Jin recalled a desperate fight when a Chinese soldier tried to take out an enemy machine gunner in close combat.
He grappled the man and bit him on the face and hands. Then the two rolled down and fell from the cliff. Both were killed.
In other battlefields, US-led forces dominated the sky while China had 0 planes in the early campaigns. Chinese troops on the ground were often sitting ducks to death from above.
I was escorting the telegraph to the front line. After the mission, I realized a bullet had shot through the brim of my hat.
Under such circumstances, China and the DPRK pushed their opponents back to the 38th parallel and signed a truce agreement in 1953. For the Chinese veterans, they say they are happy to see the country's development over the past 70 years.
Chinese people stood on their feet in Chairman Mao's time. Their lives flourished in Deng Xiaoping's period. Now the nation has become stronger.
Every inch counts in national sovereignty. When there is an invasion, we'll fight till the end. Our army isn't like the one before.
So, Professor, we just heard the bravery from those veterans of the Korean War. As you just mentioned, back then Chinese forces, volunteer forces and the DPRK forces were facing one of the strongest military in the world. So you mentioned spirit, of course that's crucial, but what else made them to defeat the invaders?
Yeah, I think the spirit that has been demonstrated by these heroic veterans and also martyrs are so important. And they're important in the sense that has been, in a way, I think, offset the gap in terms of weaponaries. I think we are so impressed by the veterans that are being interviewed. He's talking about how sort of heroic And even when these veterans, these soldiers, they had to fight with hand-to-hand combat. This is the spirit, I think, would continue 70 years ago, and it will continue to guide China, even though China is now much developed, much sort of advanced. And I think we have to also remember this war is not provoked by China. And China is a peace-loving country. And 70 years ago, China was just newly established, and it's not well developed. And there's no talk of comparison, actually. I mean, if you talk about military weaponry. But China, for the sake of peace, for the sake of defending itself, its homeland, it fought the heroic war and won the war. And 70 years later, China developed. China is now the second largest economy, and it's doing well. This is something I think we can make our veterans, my martyrs, feel comfortable. Comfort them. They will feel now what they sacrificed, the motherland has been now they paid off. But I think not one thing will remain unchanged is that China will continue to promote peace, pursue a peaceful development, will not engage any aggression. But when war is imposed on China, when China was faced the kind of aggression or that, China would fight again, fight as heroically as 70 years ago.
So tell us little bit more about the historical context back then, especially the geopolitical peril China was facing in the year 1950, because China had been solemnly against the U.S. military moves on Korean Peninsula, but the U.S. ignored China's warning, and its troops landed in Incheon on September the 15th, 1950, crossed the 38th parallel on October the 7th, and pressed on towards the Sino-Korean border. What kind of threat China was facing back then?
Yeah, at that time, I think China was facing a kind of existential threat from the largest, the most powerful country in the world, which is the largest, most powerful military. And China, and out of the consideration of peace, and made it very clear that if the U.S.-led forces cross the 38th parallel line, China would intervene, would have to intervene. But the U.S.-led forces didn't take that warning seriously, thinking that China, a newly established country, such a weak one, was not able to do that. But as we know, the history tells, China means by what it says, and it is a kind of a bitter lesson. And of course, in terms of history, in terms of a conflict, sort of a prevention or management, there are some good lessons to learn. That they say what kind of communications will be needed so that there be no miscalculations or miscommunication. That is particularly relevant in today's world.
Since you just mentioned that, tell us more about how has the result of the Korean War changed geopolitics and even global order?
Yeah, I think China paid a huge service, such a service as we sacrifice. As we said, around 200,000 soldiers died and paid their life. But China earned its position, its standing around the world, and particularly I think the major countries like in the world at that time. And the geopolitics, of course, is being at that time ended up with a kind of two opposing camps, and this is something I think China did not want to see. We today, 70 years later, the Korean Peninsula still faces the question of peace and conflict, and there are even new elements, new dimension. That's the nuclear issues, and China as a peace-loving country and a country of great importance has over the past decades and more has played a very important role in mediating and facilitating the process, not only by bringing together all the relevant parties, but also by providing, we call the Chinese wisdom. For example, on the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula, on the question of political settlement of the Korean Peninsula issues, China has put forward very important proposal, for example, how to manage the nuclear issues, denuclearization, in the meantime, the peace regime.
And Professor, while we're talking about this, the official handover ceremony of the remains of the Chinese soldiers died in the Korean War has started in Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. You're watching live footage from Shenyang. Chinese soldiers are carrying the remains of those martyrs sacrificed their lives on the Korean Peninsula, as Professor just mentioned, to safeguard home and defend the nation. You're watching live footage from Shenyang. And this year marks the 70th anniversary of the war to resist the U.S. aggression and aid Korea. And this is the latest batch of the remains of 117 fallen heroes of China from that war. Now their remains are being officially returned to their home soil. Between 2014 and 2019, a total of 599 have been returned over the past 6 years after Beijing and Seoul came to an agreement in 2013. All of them have been buried in Shenyang Martyrs Cemetery, as our reporter just filed a report from that location. Now, the handover ceremony between South Korea and China usually came in March or April around China's Qingming Festival, also known as Tomb Sweeping Day. And this year, the event was postponed for a few months because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But now, finally, the country is ready to rest the remains of those martyrs beside their comrades back on the homeland. Over 190,000 Chinese volunteers died in the war to resist the U.S. aggression and aid Korea, but very few were buried on their homeland. You're watching live footage from Shenyang. And that's it for this edition of The World Today on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye for now.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from Beijing, this is Global Watch.
Hello, it's noon in Beijing and 4 a.m. GMT. Welcome to Global Watch on CGTN. We start with something that's happening right now. South Korea has returned the remains of 117 Chinese soldiers killed in the Korean War who supported DPRK forces during the war in the 1950s. You're watching live footage from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. The handover ceremony is underway. A plane has arrived in Shenyang in northeast China and this repatriation ceremony is underway. The plane left Incheon in South Korea Sunday morning. This is the 7th such repatriation since 2014. We can see the Chinese soldiers right now cleaning the caskets of Chinese soldiers' remains, paying their highest respect. This is also part of the ceremony, and so has returned a total of nearly 600 sets of Chinese remains. This latest transfer comes months after the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War in June. And for more on that, our correspondent Jack Barton filed this report from South Korea.
The remains of 117 Chinese soldiers who died during the Korean War. On Saturday, the remains were prepared for repatriation to China. Chinese and Korean officials paid their respects as the bones of the fallen soldiers were transferred into caskets. More than 1,300 items belonging to Chinese troops are to accompany them. The repatriation was supposed to have taken place in spring, but was delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. 103 of the remains were recovered last year at Arrowhead Ridge inside the demilitarized zone that divides the peninsula. South Korea has been carrying out demining and excavation operations on the hill, the site of one of the fiercest battles of the Korean War, while 14 of the remains were unearthed in other parts of the country. The Korean peninsula is marked by many sites, identifying where battles with Chinese forces took place, often to defend or capture ridgelines like the one I'm standing on, where fierce fighting took place between Chinese soldiers as well as forces from Greece, South Korea and the United States. Seoul began repatriating remains of fallen Chinese soldiers in 2014, including many who had previously been laid to rest at this cemetery on the edge of the demilitarized zone. Jack Barton, CGTN, Yongin in South Korea.
China has made great efforts to help identify the Chinese soldiers killed in the Korean War. In the past few years, the country has set up a DNA database at the Cemetery of Korean War Martyrs in Shenyang, capital of Liaoning Province in the northeast. A technological breakthrough by a team from the PLA Academy of Military Medical Sciences enabled the database to identify 6 members of the Chinese People's Volunteers. They're among the 599 soldiers whose remains have been sent back from the Republic of Korea and reburied in the Shenyang Cemetery since 2014. In April 2019, the Ministry of Veterans Affairs of China launched an online campaign to find the unidentified heroes based on 24 personal seals found among more than 1,000 items belonging to deceased soldiers. It's the 7th such ceremony to be held after Beijing and Seoul reached an agreement in 2013. Gao Yiming has more.
March 28, 2014, at Shenyang Taoxian Airport in China's northeast. Inside the boxes include skeletal remains, as well as personal possessions such as shoes and stamps of Chinese volunteer soldiers who perished during the 3-year Korean War. Decorated in China's national flag, Fighter jets escorted them home across the Yellow Sea. Soldiers hold welcome banners, and comrades stand in salute. For this moment, they had waited for decades.
We must never forget the sacrifices of those who died, and to treat them as spiritual role models.
Over 190,000 Chinese soldiers died in the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, but very few were buried on their homeland. A total of 599 have been returned over the past 6 years after Beijing and Seoul came to an agreement in 2013. All of them have been buried in Shenyang Martyrs Cemetery, which was first established in 1951.
Since 1993, I have come to the cemetery on my own every year, just before Tomb Sweeping Festival. At first, it was spontaneous. Nowadays, though, there are fewer and fewer living veterans, so we come to pay respects in groups.
This year, 117 fallen heroes from the war are returning to China. They had to wait a few months longer than anticipated because of the coronavirus pandemic. But they're finally now ready to rest beside their comrades back on home soil. Gao Yiming, CGTN.
The Chinese People's Volunteer Army significantly contributed in the war against the U.S. aggression in Korea. They fought side by side with DPRK Army between 1950 and 1953. Here's more about their history.
The Chinese People's Volunteer Army was the armed expatriate volunteer forces deployed by the People's Republic of China during the Korean War. On October 19, 1950, at the request of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the forces crossed the Yalu River to aid the DPRK and completely withdrew by 1958. In January 1958, Beijing and Pyongyang announced a joint declaration. China decided to withdraw all its soldiers from the DPRK in 3 waves before October 1958. On October 25, 1958, a total of more than 70,000 people, including the headquarters, 3 divisions, and the logistical support forces of the Chinese Volunteer Army, left for home. Over the 8 years of war, a total of 2.9 million CPV soldiers entered the battlefield, and over 197 of them gave their lives.
Continue to trace back history. It was 1950, a year after the founding of the People's Republic of China, when US-led forces pushed the Korean War right to China's border. Hundreds of thousands of young people in China joined the war to defend their homeland. Tianyuan speaks to 2 Korean War veterans in Shenyang to learn more about what happened 70 years ago.
In 1950, 17-year-old Sun De-shan, like many young people his age, volunteered to join the Korean War.
The U.S. was like a flame. It burned the DPRK first, and next would be China. As a neighbor, China must put out the fire. If not, China would be next. We fought to defend our nation and homeland. A man without a country is like a child without a home.
Many new recruits, including Jing Donghui, were sent to the foreign battlefield after just a month of training, facing the rookies, some of history's fiercest battles, and an experience they'd remember for the rest of their lives.
While we charged forward, bombs, shells, and fragments exploded next to us. Many of us fell, but we marched on no matter what. At first we were afraid, but we knew it's either them or us, so we braved up and fought hard.
I never thought I would make it through the war. I took a hit here and here, in my hand, my head. I thought I would die there. I was lucky to be back.
China's Ministry of Civil Affairs says nearly 200,000 martyrs died on the Korean peninsula. A Chinese force known as the Iron 7th Company was down to just 7 men after several tough fights. At the bottom of a valley, Jin watched his comrades fall one by one as enemy troops swarmed up the position.
They ran out of bullets and grenades. The 7 soldiers fixed their bayonets and readied for hand-to-hand combat.
Saved by the sound of the bugle, enemy troops thought there was a counterattack and retreated. Chinese soldiers often had to fight taller and stronger enemies in the most primitive way on account of the huge gap in weapons. Jin recalled a desperate fight when a Chinese soldier tried to take out an enemy machine gunner in close combat.
He grappled the man and bit him on the face and hands. Then the 2 rolled down and fell from the cliff. Both were killed.
In other battlefields, U.S.-led forces dominated the sky while China had 0 planes in the early campaigns. Chinese troops on the ground were often sitting ducks to death from above.
I was escorting the telegraph to the front line. After the mission, I realized a bullet had shot through the brim of my hat.
Under such circumstances, China and the DPRK pushed their opponents back to the 38th parallel and signed a truce agreement in 1953. For the Chinese veterans, they say they are happy to see the country's development over the past 70 years.
Chinese people stood on their feet in Chairman Mao's time. Their lives flourished in Deng Xiaoping's period. Now the nation has become stronger.
Every inch counts in national sovereignty. When there is an invasion, we'll fight till the end. Our army isn't like the one before.
For more insight, let's talk to Professor Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. So, Professor, the war ended in 1953 with this Korean armistice agreement. But this is not a permanent peace deal. So, do you think people will see a permanent peace deal or permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula in the near future?
Indeed, I think there are expectations and efforts making to ensure war will not return to the Korean Peninsula and the region again. And as you rightly said, that the war of Korea, the Korean War, lasted such a bloody war, caused so many casualties and destruction, both in terms of course humans and properties, to China, to the 2 Koreans, and also to those who for different reasons joined the war. And the 3 years when after in 1953 a kind of a ceasefire was reached, and but it's never been able to reach a kind of a peace in a way that we are looking for. And in recent years, we have seen that the tension has been rising and the danger of conflict or even war. But this time could be a nuclear war, different kind of war, more destruction being reached. So that's why there have been called and efforts, and China, including, has done a lot to establish a kind of peace regime to replace the Armistice Treaty, and so that the parties concerned and the region as a whole, the 2 Koreans in particular, could enjoy peace. But it's not easy. It's not easy in the sense that there are huge differences among them. There are concerns of legitimate concerns of security from the 2 sides, in particular North Korean side. And I think if the country in the region and the world at large learn good lessons from this war, and sooner or later we will be able to achieve that. And China has always will continue to play a role to ensure war would not replicate it, will not return. The sacrifice by these martyrs for defending the homeland, defending peace in the region will not be wasted. And China will continue to work with countries in the region on the peninsula, the 2 Koreans in particular, and also I think beyond the United States, and hopefully would achieve that.
Well, Professor, we'll be getting back to you on this. You're watching Global Watch on CGTN. We'll keep you updated on the repatriation of China remains of Chinese soldiers killed in the Korean War. But coming up next, Chinese President Xi Jinping calls for more efforts made on stability and ethnic unity in Xinjiang. President Donald Trump names conservative Judge Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court vacancy.
"75 years ago, countries came together in a stand against conflict and inequality. The United Nations was born. 75 years on, countries face new forms of crises in a rapidly changing world. But the UN's vision has stood the test of time to bring people together for peace, protection, and progress. With milestones in human rights, public welfare, and sustainable development. In 2020, against a backdrop of unprecedented challenges, the call for solidarity is louder. Together against a common threat. Together toward a common goal. Shaping the future we want in the world that we need as one."
You're watching Global Watch on CGTN. Chinese President Xi Jinping has addressed the third Central Work Conference on Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. He praised the region's achievement and outlined priorities for the future.
The second Central Conference on Xinjiang was held in 2014. The central government pledged better governance in the region to promote economic and social development. Since then, Xi Jinping says Xinjiang has made unprecedented achievements, and a sense of happiness and security has increased among people of all ethnic groups. From 2014 to 2019, Xinjiang's economy grew by an average of 7.2% each year to nearly 1.63 trillion won. Economic development helped improve infrastructure, with highways linking all cities and prefectures in the region. Living standards also improved. Per capita income of Xinjiang residents grew by 9.1% a year. 99.7% of residents joined the basic medical insurance system. Poverty eradication has made strong progress, too. From 2014 to 2019, nearly 3 million were lifted out of poverty, leaving just 2.2% of people under the poverty line. Xi Jinping says the achievements have resulted from joint efforts of the central government and people of all ethnic groups. President Xi says long-term stability and the rule of law are a priority, and that lawful religious demands should be protected and the healthy development of religion should be promoted. And he stressed the importance of a strong sense of community for the Chinese nation, urging authorities to boost communication between different ethnic groups to consolidate ethnic unity in Xinjiang. President Xi says development is the foundation for the long-term stability of Xinjiang, saying their development must be incorporated into the Belt and Road Initiative and China's westward opening. President Xi says good governance in Xinjiang is vital to the whole country, and that previous achievements show that the party's strategy on Xinjiang is correct and must be continued. Brian Dorman, CGTN.
For more insight into that, earlier we talked to Professor Huo Zhenxing with the China University of Political Science and Law and asked him about poverty alleviation and development in Xinjiang.
During the past 5 years, Xinjiang has been a place of stability and prosperity. And the economy develops very fast. And in my opinion, social stability and ethnic solidarity are the most important basis to support these achievements. Or in other words, achievements have been made in past 5 years suggest that the policy of Chinese central government towards Xinjiang is right and efficient. And the fight against terrorism and extremism there has achieved decisive success. Xinjiang has many distinct regional advantages. For example, Xinjiang is extremely rich in culture and natural resources, and it is located in the region that connects the Chinese market towards the mid-Asian countries and even to Europe. Or in other words, it is very, very important to the Belt and Road Initiative. So in my eyes, as long as the social stability can be maintained, Xinjiang, I think, is attractive and charming place to the whole world. So I think that the eradication of poverty is not a problem as long as stability and solidarity is maintained. And I think that when the economy develops, I think this will, on the other hand, strengthen the social stabilities. So I think that's the bright future that we can expect in Xinjiang in the future.
And later in the program, we'll continue our special coverage, our month-long series, Amazing Xinjiang, as our team of reporters bring you a 360-degree view of the diverse cultural heritage of the region. Do stay tuned for that. But now let's turn to US politics and the announcement of the next pick for the Supreme Court. President Donald Trump has nominated the only person he interviewed face-to-face for the job, Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative federal judge. Toby Muse reports.
US President Donald Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court following the death last week of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If confirmed, it would push the Supreme Court decisively to the right, giving conservatives a 6-3 majority on the High Court.
It is my honor to nominate one of our nation's most brilliant and gifted legal minds to the Supreme Court. She is a woman of unparalleled achievement, towering intellect, sterling credentials, and unyielding loyalty to the Constitution, Judge Amy Coney Barrett.
I fully understand that this is a momentous decision for a president. And if the Senate does me the honor of confirming me, I pledge to discharge the responsibilities of this job to the very best of my ability.
3 years ago, Barrett came to prominence when Trump installed her on the Chicago-based 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. She has taught law at the University of Notre Dame, one of the most prominent U.S. Catholic universities. Barrett also clerked for Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who was considered the leading conservative on the court until his death in 2016. At 48, she would be the youngest judge on the High Court. Anti-abortion activists welcomed the news, hoping that Barrett will be a decisive voice on restricting the availability of abortion in the United States. Her opponents have described her as right-wing and a religious zealot, thanks to her belonging to the People of Praise, a religious community in Indiana.
I hope they follow the law and not just bring in what the people that appoint them want them to do. That's my fear and my hope that they don't.
I just really hope that they will keep church and state separate, because that is a tragic thing.
I think it's awesome, and I think that they have to judge the circumstances by the law, not by a political situation, but by what the law was established hundreds of years ago.
Now the nomination goes before the Senate Judiciary Committee, which would hold confirmation hearings to vet the nominee. Once the committee approves the nomination, it moves to the Senate floor for a final vote. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that he has the vote to get Trump's nominee through the Senate, but has not said publicly that a vote would take place ahead of the November 3rd election. To install her on the High Court by Election Day would make her confirmation one of the fastest in living memory. Yet, there seems little the Democratic Party can do to stop her confirmation. The White House hopes that the choice of Barrett will energize its base and get social conservatives to go out and vote for Trump in the upcoming election. But the choice of Barrett also plays into the election in another way. President Trump has said he wants to see a full Supreme Court by Election Day because he believes this year the general election could end up being decided by the Supreme Court. Toby Muse reporting for CGTN, Washington.
Now let's cross live to the northeastern Chinese city of Shenyang. A ceremony commemorating China's fallen heroes is being held in Shenyang's Taoxian International Airport. You're watching live footage from the venue. Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan is expected to deliver a speech.
中共中央政治局委员、国务院副总理孙春兰同志，中央宣传部、中央对外联络部、外交部。
You're watching live footage of Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. This is a commemoration ceremony for the return of the remains of the Chinese soldiers died in the Korean War. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the war to resist the U.S. aggression and aid Korea. The remains of 117 fallen heroes from the war are returning to China from South Korea. The ceremony starts now.
Now let's give the floor to member of the Politburo of the Communist Party of China and also Vice Premier of the State Council, Madam Sun Chunlan. Dear comrades, today we gather here in this solemn memorial ceremony to welcome back the 117 fallen heroes who fought the war in the Korean Peninsula. We commemorate their spirit of sacrifice. Here, on behalf of the CPC Central Committee, the State Council, I would like to pay my highest tribute to the fallen heroes. My condolences also go to the family members of the fallen soldiers and the fellow soldiers who fought with these fallen heroes side by side. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. 70 years ago, the bold volunteer army soldiers hold high the banner of protecting peace and resisting aggression. They marched across the Yalu River and fought side by side with soldiers of DPRK. After 2 years and 9 months, they eventually won the war against Japanese aggression. They safeguarded the peace, security, and dignity of the new China. They also protected the peace and stability in Asia as well as in the world in this heavy battle. More than 100,000 volunteer soldiers sacrificed their lives. Most of these fallen heroes were buried overseas. Over the past 70 years, the motherland has never forgotten the fallen heroes. We have never forgotten the contribution they have made in safeguarding peace and protecting security. We have never forgotten the fallen heroes who have left us with this legacy. And we have never forgotten that the red flag is red because of the color of blood. We always bear in mind their spirit of sacrifice and loyalty. A nation without hope is a nation without heroes. A nation with hope is a nation with heroes. So today, we stand here in this solemn sacrifice to welcome back those royal bones and their spirits. The spirit left over from this Korean War has long been the spiritual legacy of the Chinese people to overcome difficulties one after another. For over 70 years, the Communist Party of China has united people of different ethnic groups, and we have overcome one difficulty after another. We created an unprecedented miracle of economic growth. We also managed to achieve long-term social stability, and the Chinese people and Chinese nation saw a journey of standing up, and gradually we are becoming a strong power. In this year, faced with the unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, under the strong leadership of the CPC Central Committee, with President Xi Jinping as the core, the whole country was united as one, and we have secured the basic victory against this epidemic. This left over the spirit of respecting science, uniting all the people in a fight against the coronavirus pandemic, and this is a full manifestation of the legacy and spirits from the Korean War. History has once again proven that the Chinese people, under the leadership of the Communist Party of China, is undefeatable and invincible. At present, the landscape of the international community continues to change. The Chinese people are now faced with bright prospects, and we stand at the crossroad of the millennium goals, and we have to bear in mind our promises, and we have to always put people in the first place. And we need to put people's aspiration for a better life as our goals. We need to advocate the spirits of the Korean War and the sacrifices of the Chinese voluntary army. And we need to sing for the patriotism of these soldiers, so that we can constantly add in more momentum to the great drive of building a modernized country with Chinese features. And we need to cherish this international environment of peace and be committed to the development path of peace and work with all the countries to build a community of shared future for all mankind, so that we can make new contributions to peace and development of the whole world. Let us be united under the leadership of the CPC Central Committee with President Xi Jinping as the core. Let's make further endeavors and make more contributions to the construction of a well-off society and to the realization of the Chinese dream of rejuvenation. Long live the fallen heroes of the volunteer army. Now we take 3 bows to the fallen heroes.
20鞠躬，3鞠躬，护送志愿军烈士遗骸上灵车，向右转，抬高空。
This is a commemoration ceremony for the return of the remains of the Chinese soldiers died in the Korean War. You're watching live footage from the northeastern Chinese city of Shenyang. The remains of 117 Chinese soldiers are returned this time so that they can put to rest on their home soil. Now, for more insight, let's talk to Professor Ren in the studio. So, Professor, Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan has just delivered a speech at a commemoration, and she mentioned several times the spirit of the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. Now, what's your understanding of this spirit?
The spirit of the great spirit of against resisting American aggression and aid Korea is important in the sense that 70 years ago, these martyrs, the veterans and soldiers, they have, for the sake of defending peace, world peace, defending our homeland, uphold justice, have sacrificed so much, shed their blood, and by overcoming untold difficulties and finally won the war. And today, 70 years later, the world has changed so much. China has become so stronger and so developed. But that spirit remains relevant, and it is even more important as China looking ahead and continue to show more responsibilities for defending peace, more responsibilities to ensure stability and security will be, I think, safeguard for China and for the world, and to ensure that China will continue to play a role in building jointly with the world for a community community of shared future.
And in her speech, the Vice Premier has said 70 years on since the Korean War, China has fought over all the difficulties, one and another. As you just mentioned earlier, the Korean War was hard fought and hard won. So, looking at China's development in the past 7 decades, would you say that all the achievements made in this long process is not a given, but rather also hard fought and hard won?
Yeah, I think certainly 70 years has passed. In few days' time, we are going to celebrate another national day. That is going to be 71st National Day, and again, an important occasion to not only to commemorate and remember these martyrs. The martyrs not only in this war, the Korean War, but so many martyrs that have been sacrificed, to give up their lives. But also, I think, to ensure to accomplish our missions, and we need to carry forward the spirit of these martyrs, sacrifice, I think, and overcome difficulties, and working so hard either in peacetime or wartime in a way that to promote peace, promote stability, and promote development by working together as one and working together with countries, peace-loving countries in the world.
Talking about Chinese people working as one, in her speech, Vice Premier Sun Trunlan also said that the Chinese people, led by the Communist Party of China, cannot be defeated. What do you make of this notion?
Yeah, I think all the achievements and progress that has been made in the past 70 years would not be possible without the correct leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.
And if you talk about the very decision for the Chinese soldiers, volunteer soldiers, to participate in this war on the Korean Peninsula was made by the Chinese Communist Party, led by Chairman Mao Zedong back then, right?
Yeah, I think that was as we have been discussing, 70 years ago, New China, the People's Republic, was just founded. I mean, less than almost 1 year. It's not easy. It was not easy, and even without with no debate, there are some different views on how to do that. But the Chinese Communist Party, the Central Committee led by Chairman Mao Zedong, made the decision with courage and a resolution that we had to fight the war. We have to fight the war to resist the aggression of the U.S. And we have to fight the war to defend peace in the world, to uphold justice. So this kind of sacrifice, of course, 70 years later now paid off, and we have to continue to do that if necessary.
And from the Vice Premier's speech, another theme is quite clear, is that spirit we just talked about is not something for history, but it's quite relevant to today. For example, she mentioned Chinese people's resilience and the united spirits in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I think in her speech, she made it very clear, a nation would have to have some spirit. And I think the great spirit of resisting U.S. aggression against Korea, and also the spirit of fighting the COVID-19 is relevant. It's even more relevant today as China, I think, is fighting the COVID-19, in the meantime pushing for the continued development against the various kind of changes around, both at home and in the world. So we need spirit. We need to carry forward this spirit, and we need to work together as a nation as we are celebrating the National Day in a few days' time. 70
years ago, as you just mentioned, the world was faced by hegemony, unilateralism, one-sided bullying. Do you think the world is still facing those threats right now, and people and responsible countries should also be very vigilant about those threats nowadays?
Yeah, the world certainly has been changed so much compared to that 70 years ago. But the danger, the risk, one particular country, for the sake of its own pursuit of hegemony and unilateralism, is, not much different. And the danger of conflict and is there. And if there's a war, or if the conflict like that, can be more dangerous, because we have more devastating wars and more devastating sort of conflict. That's why exactly I think it got countries like China and other peace-loving countries to work together to continue to do its job, to safeguard peace, to safeguard security, and to resist kind of this trend, this pursuit of unilateralism, either because of a kind of hegemony or because of, for the sake of some of the personal political agenda of some politicians in the United States. So the danger is real and there.
And having said that, another important notion from the Vice Premier's speech is that a nation with hope cannot live without heroes and remembering history. What does that mean for ordinary people living nowadays, which maybe for them a war is quite a remote scenario?
Yeah, I think China has, and the world to some extent, has living in a peace kind of peacetime for quite a long time. And for that, I think to commemorate these veterans, these martyrs, I think the first and foremost thing is like Vice Premier Sun Cheng-lai said, we should never forget the sacrifice of these martyrs. And 70 years has passed. I think the motherland and people, Chinese people, have never forget these martyrs. And even though I think a lot of them now the remains has been recovered and returned, and they, for some reason, 70 years ago, they were buried not in the homeland. So this ceremony, this event to commemorate, to welcome welcome home these martyrs, is a reminder of average Chinese people who have enjoyed the peace and who to some extent have taken for granted peace. Had to remember that this has not come easy. This has come because of the sacrifice of these martyrs, because of the contribution of these the great veterans of Chinese soldiers.
And talking about peace cannot be taken for granted. We just watched those veterans in their senior ages saluting to their fallen comrades. And we know that China has been making nationwide efforts to bring those fallen heroes back home and also try to identify them by all means possible. And that was a commemoration ceremony for the return of the remains of the Chinese soldiers died in the Korean War from South Korea, and the event was held in the northeastern Chinese city of Shenyang. As South Korea hands over more remains and belongings, our reporter Tianyuan visits the place where the martyrs will be put to rest.
Today we're going to visit the cemetery of Korean War martyrs in Shenyang, home to hundreds of fallen Chinese heroes in one of the world's fiercest conflicts, what China calls the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. This year, the cemetery is scheduled to receive 117 Chinese martyrs who were killed in the war 70 years ago, just a few days before China's Martyrs' Day. It's the 7th batch China has received from South Korea since 2014, when the country first started transferring them.
This reflects the two countries' friendly and peaceful settlement on this matter, a token of goodwill by South Korea that China appreciates.
On Monday, the heroes' coffins are expected to join the comrades in an underground tomb in the cemetery. This year's burial is the second largest after nearly 440 Chinese soldiers were laid to rest in 2014.
We'll send a staff member to the airport to coordinate the work. Later, there will be a proper burial for the remains of the Chinese martyrs who were killed in the war.
China's Ministry of Civil Affairs says nearly 200,000 Chinese soldiers died on the Korean peninsula during the 3-year conflict. Most of them were buried on foreign soil, far from home.
After the Korean War, the two sides have boosted trade, and both have realized that peace is crucial to well-being. So the two have valued and cherished it since then.
Between 2014 and 2019, the remains of nearly 600 Chinese soldiers was sent back from South Korea. Seoul has agreed to continue cooperating with Beijing to recover the remains of Chinese soldiers and finally return them to their resting place back home.
On Monday, which is tomorrow, CGTN will bring you a live coverage of the burial of the remains of the Chinese soldiers died on the Korean War in the northeastern Chinese city of Shenyang. Do stay tuned for that. You're watching Global Watch on CGTN. Coming up, we'll take a look at why thousands of Israelis are protesting outside Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's residence. And we take the temperature in London, where anti-lockdown demonstrators have been clashing with police.
Stories of people, culture, and nature on a thrilling 8-day journey through China's vast high-speed rail network. Setting off from the Chinese capital to down south in Guangzhou, Shanghai on the east, as well as nearby Zhangjiakou, its partner for the Winter Olympics. Plus, a visit to the roof of the world, aboard the world's highest railway, from glitzy metropolis to vast plains and rugged mountains. Join CGTN on a fast motion journey, exploring China's beauty and diversity for an experience like no other, starting October 1st.
You're watching Global Watch on CGTN. Now we turn to southwest China. 17 people have been trapped in a coal mine in Chongqing municipality. The cause of the accident is carbon monoxide overrun. For more on that, let's cross live to our reporter Meng Qingsheng in Chengdu, not far away from Chongqing municipality. Hello Qingsheng, tell us more about the investigation and the rescue.